Thank you very much for inviting me here today, Marie. I will try to answer 3 questions during these brief presentations. What are biodiversity markets? Do they work? And why are they politically so appealing? So biodiversity markets are an old idea that is about to be implemented on a big scale. Biodiversity offsetting, for those who are not familiar, is the idea that we would be able to compensate for the destruction of biodiversity somewhere by restoration actions elsewhere. Say, for example, that you're an infrastructure company and that you want to build an airport over a flamingo habitat in the south of Spain. Well, you have 3 cases. The first case would be environmental regulation, where you would be told probably that no, you need to build your airport somewhere else. The second case is traditional biodiversity offsetting, where you would be told, okay, you can do your airport, but you need to compensate by recreating a habitat for flamingos within 10 kilometers. Even though we know in reality that in most cases we are unable to comprehensively recreate all the ecosystemic functions that have been destroyed. And the third case is a more extreme version of biodiversity offsetting, the one that's been promoted by the European Commission for years, where you will be told, okay, you need to build your airport, but you need to compensate not within 10 kilometers, but somewhere in Europe, and not necessarily by the same type of habitat that was destroyed. So you could compensate by restoring a habitat for bats in Greece or planting some trees in Romania. But of course, in reality, we all know that more bats do not equal less flamingos. So biodiversity offsetting is not new at all. It already exists in several countries, including the USA, parts of Australia and Canada. What is new, however, is that it is about to completely change scale. We have the UN, who officially included biodiversity offsets in the new global biodiversity framework at the CBD COP15. We have Australia, who is in the process of launching a nature repair market. The UK will launch a biodiversity offset market this November. And France recently launched a partnership with the UK and Gabon to work on a market for biodiversity certificates. At EU level, the European Commission has been promoting biodiversity offsetting for 12 years, first under the name habitat banking, and more recently under the name nature-based solutions. And it also recently included it in the draft delegated act of the taxonomy of sustainable finance. And last but not least, there is a big push by private lobbies for biodiversity offsets and markets. They have spinned it a bit differently and rebranding it as biodiversity credits and certificates, but it's essentially the same, and I'll be very happy to provide more details on that later. Now, the real question is, does biodiversity offsetting work? Well, first, it is important to note that by definition, offsetting does not aim at curbing destruction, nor at compensating for past destruction, but at compensating for future destruction. So what that means is that at best, if it works, offsetting merely displaces destruction, but does not reduce it. Now, more crucially, biodiversity offsetting has been shown to be plagued with intractable conceptual environmental integrity issues. If you think carbon offsetting is bad, and it is, as we have seen with the recent scandals that have shown that more than 80% of carbon offsets are hot air, well, remember that there are only 6 main greenhouse gases, and the equivalences between the gases are more or less okay. Now, compare that to the millions of species and the complex web of interdependencies, and you see immediately that simplifying it and standardizing it into a few tradable assets is incomparably more difficult and creates infinitely worse environmental integrity issues. And in fact, the track record of biodiversity offsetting so far is appalling, with between 2/3 and 3/4 of projects that fail. And that is simply because the science of restoration is in its infancy, and our scientific knowledge of ecosystems is very incomplete. Now, beyond the environmental integrity issues, offsetting has also been amply documented to be associated with conflict over land rights and land use, human rights abuses, and green neocolonialism. And biodiversity markets would also transfer critical conservation decisions to financial markets that are focused on short-term private profits and not on public interest, and that are prone to regular crises. So for all these reasons, we already know that biodiversity markets will be an environmental failure and likely create major social and human rights issues. So the next question is, what explains the political appeal of biodiversity markets? Well, the proponents of these markets argue that we need to include nature in our economies in order to save it, and that we need to attract private capital via private markets to fund conservation. Of course, the history of conservation shows that we absolutely do not need to put a price on nature in order to have sound conservation policies. What is truly needed is tighter environmental regulations mandating a decline in destruction, such as the Loi Littorale in France. And even if there was a need to shift private capital flows, it still does not require creating markets on nature. And traditional environmental regulations that would mandate a decline in destruction would lead automatically, just like any regulation, to a reassessment of the future profit of the impacted sectors, and then mechanically to a shift in private capital flows. Now, as for financial flows aimed at helping vulnerable countries fund conservation actions, or so they claim, what is needed is loss and damages discussions based on differentiated historical responsibilities and not conditional financial market instruments. Now, I also very often hear that, okay, biodiversity offsetting does not really work, but it's better than nothing. But is it? In reality, it is arguably not, because it diverts the conversation away from the need for tighter environmental regulations and for rich countries to curb their destruction. And also, this is a moot point, because no country today could say that it will do nothing about the 6 mass extinction of species. So the real benchmark is not nothing, but alternative policy tools. And in fact, it has been argued that the main political appeal of nature markets resides precisely in their limited effectiveness. Most governments today are willing to act about climate change and biodiversity loss, but only to the extent that it does not threaten their short-term economic growth and competitiveness. In other words, they're only willing to act at the margin and far less than science tells us we need to. And so we therefore understand the political goal of biodiversity offsetting, just like carbon offsetting before it, to be enabling rich countries to maintain the status quo and avoid changing their lifestyle, while also creating a new asset class for their financial industry. Bush Sr. famously said at the '92 Rio summit, "The American way of life is not negotiable." Well, it's all in this sentence and its incredible brutality and stupidity, and it's not just the USA. So my question to you is, do we want to repeat with biodiversity the failure of Kyoto carbon markets? I personally do not think we can afford to. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Frederic. And I now turn to Marco Lambertini. You've been working on many different tools. You can go. You've been working on many different tools to protect biodiversity. And I mean, Frederic has been talking about offsetting, but you have worked on many different other economic tools. Can you tell us a bit about it? Thank you very much, Mariello, everyone. Let me just start from an interesting article I came across very recently. The title was, "There's never been a better time for humans," referring to all the progress on life expectancy, health improvements, at least in some parts of the world, childbirth mortality decrease, etc., compared to about 100 years ago. But then the title continued and said, bracket, so there's never been a better time for humans, bracket, nor more dire for the planet. And I think the title so beautifully captured the paradox, the dichotomy they were living in today. The last 70 years
70 years, blink of an eye compared to the history of life on Earth, even compared to our own civilization's history, is what the scientists are calling the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration when humanity has been using, in an exponentially accelerating way, all sorts of natural resources, from fossil fuels to fish, minerals, agriculture produce, water, any natural resource you can think of has followed the same exponentially growing curve. 3 drivers. First of all, not in order of importance. First of all, population growth. In the last 70 years, we have been adding 1 billion new people to the world every decade. It took about 500,000 years to get to the first billion. Second, technology. Technology is often celebrated as something as the savior of our future. Technology has equipped us, has enabled us to exploit and destroy nature much more effectively and much more deeply. Third, overconsumption, unsustainable overconsumption. In some regions of the world, the most developed one, obviously leaving a huge inequality gap elsewhere. This is the paradox I'm talking about. And this paradox, why is a paradox? Because while we have developed, we have degraded the environment. The very natural resources, the very ecosystem that has actually been the foundation of our development has been degrading slowly and faster until today. What that means is that finally we're beginning to understand, and I hope this is beginning to be the mainstream thinking, that actually environmental degradation is something that is not only going to affect the prospect of future progress, of future equality for humanity, but is also beginning to undermine some of the progress made so far. There are some terrifying statistics about the increase of extreme hunger, extreme poverty due to climate change and droughts. There are statistics about the decrease, for the first time in 100 years, of the life expectancy, mean life expectancy of people on the planet due to the pandemic. So we are beginning finally to realize that nature loss is not just an isolated ecological issue to do with the future of tigers and whales and butterflies that I hope we all love and respect. It's something that actually is beginning to affect our economy, our social stability, our health, our well-being. In other words, is beginning to be perceived as a security issue for humanity. And, by the way, as was mentioned earlier, a justice issue, because the most vulnerable population are paying the highest price, and an intergenerational justice issue, because your young people are going to pay an even greater price. For me, having started as a young volunteer at 12 years old in the nature conservation movement, this is a sea change in mindset and perception about nature. We are beginning to understand we cannot take nature for granted any longer. We've got to take care of it. And there are signs that this is beginning to happen. You may be saying that global agreements are just pieces of paper. It's true, but they're reflecting the sentiment of society and also the political debate and leadership. The Paris Agreement on climate, the recent, finally, agreement on biodiversity that has actually agreed globally on a new global goal for nature, halt and reverse nature loss, biodiversity loss by 2030. That means the world has agreed to actually have more nature by the end of the decade, by 2030, not less. A nature-positive global goal. These are all signals of a new awareness, and obviously the good news in all this is that science and the evidence of the impact of our activities on nature, but also the consequences that this is having on our lives has never been greater. This is a moment of transition, a moment of reflection, and I feel that it is actually a very exciting moment. When I was young, your age, many of you are young here, this discussion was nowhere. Today, we are in the European Parliament discussing it. Super exciting. But let me just say, the fundamental problem is that we are not valuing nature enough. Culturally, spiritually, emotionally, but also economically. And that's a big problem. It's a big problem because today, only dead nature has an economic value. A tree begins to be valuable after it's cut down, turned into furniture, building materials. A fish becomes valuable after it is fished, killed, and served as food to us and, as you probably know, to our farmed animals as well. Flowers are valuable when you cut it and sell it for conferences in our houses. They're not valuable at all when they are in a field, beautifying the landscape and being a critical component of the ecosystem. This is a fundamental problem, I think. This is a fundamental problem because unless we are able to put an economic value on nature, wild nature, intact nature, and not instead of the other values or the intrinsic value that we all strongly feel about, I'm sure you do and I do as well, but unless we change the paradigm in terms of putting an economic value in nature, nature will continue to be expendable. We'll have no chance to compete with the destructive forces that until now have destroyed nature year after year, year after year, and it's happening as we speak. This is a fundamental truth of today. And forests and wetlands and coasts will never be able to compete and will be deprioritized from business and political decisions against roads and agricultural fields and resorts. This is not about putting a price on nature, commodifying it. I feel uncomfortable as well about that because nature is life, life is priceless, but in this case, priceless means invaluable. But today, priceless means worthless. And that's why we are letting companies and governments make decisions and getting away with destroying nature without paying any consequence and no cost. This is the reality today. This is happening every day in our lives. So that's the fundamental problem. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not about putting a price on nature. It's more putting a cost on the destruction of nature and hold accountable the ones who caused it and reward the ones who don't. Frederic has made a very good analysis of the problems with some of the financial markets-based mechanisms suggested today. I have the same doubts, my organization as well, the same doubts of Frederic. But I would like to come back maybe to this later in the second part of the debate, because there are also, I think from the problem that we're seeing today, and agree with his analysis, there are also opportunities we can build on. But that's for later because I don't have time. Let me just conclude by saying one thing. A question is then, are the markets, the same markets that today has been, in the last decades particularly, have been driving nature loss, could those markets actually become the saviors of nature? The answer, in my view, is not alone. Meaning that any financial market-based approach to nature conservation must be coupled with two things. First of all, public support and demand, that in turn drives strong regulation on setting standards, on developing parameters, clear reporting rules, and finally, accountability. That's fundamental. But the two combined possibly have the opportunity to produce the shift, the change that we all want, a deep, radical system change in our current failing economic system, failing the planet, failing the people at the same time. How do we drive that without regulation and without bringing and shifting the economy is the question that we need to answer. But think about it. If we try and put all the safeguards that we want around the mechanisms to make them work, not fail, we have a chance to really drive our economy to a different place, our economic model. If we don't, we leave the impunity and the no-cost opportunity to companies and government to continue to do what they've done today. So for me, it is worth exploring. It's one of the options. It's not a silver bullet. It's one of the options, but it is important to consider, not to dismiss entirely. Finally, friends, this is not just about economy. Economy is a reflection on the way we perceive ourselves as a society, in the world, is the way we relate to nature, is the way we value nature in so many different ways. There is a bigger challenge here, which is about the way we perceive nature as a society. Moving away, as Frederic said earlier, from this anthropocentric perspective, the delusional idea that we can continue to destroy waste resources with no consequences. This has to stop. And when we all are aligned on that new philosophy, that new approach, that new positioning of humanity within the natural world, then we can also tackle issues around our economy. We know today that, in fact, this is not just desirable, it's necessary, because at the end of the day, today we know that we, humanity, depends on nature much more, in fact, than nature depends on us. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I turn to Clive Spash. You're an economist. And of course, okay. Seems funny. So you're an economist. And of course, what we're talking about, would it be beyond growth or putting a price of nature? It lies on economic theories and approach, right? So what's your view? What can you tell us about on which economical view this relies?
Thank you, and I'm very glad to be here. So let me start by saying in 1952, the second European President of the Parliament said that Europe, to be united, needed to deconstruct things. And I think there's a lot that I've heard in the last 48 hours or so that needs deconstructing. So let's start by a few comments like a precursor to blow away a few myths about markets. Let me start by saying markets are not efficient. Market prices do not reflect resource scarcity. There is no such thing as a true price. There is no such thing as getting the prices right. This is the kind of rhetoric you hear all the time. We're going to get the prices right, right? Markets are going to work. Markets, there is no such thing as the market. There are different types of markets. They are institutions. They are created and they are regulated, right? In order to set up a market, you have to have regulation. You have to have private property rights. You have to decide what constitutes a commodity, what is in the market and what is out of the market, right? Do we have slaves in the market anymore? No, right? But this is the point. Okay, what about women? Are women in the market or are they out of the market? We have economic feminists who are telling us that there's unpaid labour, right? But do we want all the labour to be paid and made into part of a market? It's the same issue that we have with the environment. The point is that once you look at what markets are, how they're constructed and they're institutionalised, what you realise is that markets are institutions of power and power relationships. What gets included in the market and what gets excluded from the market is about the power of different players in the marketplace and in the society. So much is made of, for example, of there being subsidies. There's much talk, even the World Bank does this, that there are subsidies that are being paid and we should get rid of subsidies so markets would operate efficiently. Everything is subsidized. Look at the infrastructure. When you build infrastructure, you are allowing certain things to happen. If you build roads, then you allow cars. If you build airports, you allow planes. These things are built by governments, they are subsidized, and they help you to create certain types of markets, right? They're supported. But look at earlier today we had Olivier Lazard raising the geopolitical issues, right? If you look at growth and you look at the militarized society that we live in, then you will find that growth correlates with militarization. And it's not just China and Russia, like she said. It's also the United States. It's also the United States free market system depends on the largest military in the world. It's also British colonialism. There was a British Empire, there was a French Empire, there was a German Empire, there were the Dutch. So all of this means that supply chains are created, securitized, and backed by military. That means they're all subsidized. So now I'll get to my speech. Okay. What we have is missing markets, right? So what's the economic explanation for why we need these interventions, why we have to go around pricing things? Well, Lord Stern, after his attempts at cost-benefit analysis on climate change, claims that the climate change is the largest market failure ever, right? But not in the sense that capitalism is fundamentally flawed as a structure or it's a disaster socially and ecologically. No, it's a failure that can be corrected by intervention to get the prices right. So he actually has reports, right, supported by Michael Jacobs, who was here yesterday, who famously goes around saying that this was a great thing that he did, a report that says better growth, better climate, right? Just think about it. Then we have Dasgupta, right? The Dasgupta review that came out recently on biodiversity. What's Dasgupta's take? Oh, well, you know, he wants to turn nature into capital. So why would you turn nature into capital? So you can get a rate of return on it. You can treat it like a financial asset, like any other financial asset. So natural capital markets does. We heard earlier today, right, the Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries was telling us that natural capital is the policy that the European community is pushing, the Commission is pushing, and that we're going to get the accounting prices right. This is Dasgupta's terminology. Get the accounting prices right. Take things into account. Okay, so underlying this is what we call externality theory. Well, I don't. I call it cost shifting. But that's what the mainstream economists call it, right? So rather than talking about externalities, we should talk about the way the system actually purposefully pushes costs onto others. That's how you make money in the system, right? So internalizing externalities is meant to be the solution. How do you do that, right? So we're told by the mainstream economists that what we can do is we can do cost-benefit analysis. We can include the values that we were just told about, right? So if something doesn't have a price, it doesn't have a value. Bullshit, right? Of course we value nature. We just don't value it in money terms. So they get the claims that, you know, carbon can be priced, we can price all the pollution, we can get all the damages priced, and what do we mean when we say cost? What do we mean when we say things like, oh, it's not about the price, it's about the cost? What you mean is, you mean dead people. We mean climate change, drowning people and then dying. We mean health impacts. We mean biodiversity destruction. This is the costs, right? So how are these things going to be valued? Okay? How is it going to be valued? Well, the way you go about it is you set up pseudo-markets. The most common technique is called contingent valuation or stated preference methods. And that basically goes out and conducts surveys and you ask individuals what is their maximum willingness to pay for X, right? For a tiger, for an elephant, for some more wetland. For what? For all sorts of things, right? And so if we're going to start including all aspects of these biodiversity into the marketplace, then we've got to put a price on everything. So how much are you going to pay for another spider, a rat, a microorganism? You know, why should we even be doing this? Why would we be appealing to individual people's preferences and their willingness to pay? People clearly do not have preferences about microorganisms and rats, right? So this is really problematic. What are you doing here? You're confusing the whole understanding of ecology, which is about the integrity of ecosystems. And people do not value the integrity of ecosystems, right? With preferences. What you're doing is you're starting to treat the nature like a flavor of ice cream. You know, people have preferences over ice cream flavors, strawberry or chocolate. Oh, I don't know. Well, you know, but biodiversity, tigers, lions, whatever, this is going, you know, when you actually go out there and you ask people in surveys what they value, well, what do they value? They like lions and tigers. They like pandas. That's why the WWF has a panda logo, right? What they don't like then is not valued. Now, if you seriously go down this route, what will you do? You will end up with the selective extinction of unattractive species. And this is not a joke, right? This is happening because zoos have changed the way that they actually preserve species on the basis of consumer preferences of visitors to zoos. So unattractive snake species are no longer preserved in the zoos, right? This is really happening. This is what markets do. Okay, so we're appealing to preferences here. Now, just to so that my French colleagues understand what I'm saying here, Valorisation monétaire n'est rien d'autre que sortir un lapin d'un chapeau. Okay, so we're misconceptualizing values. Values are being misconceptualized. Markets aren't just going out there and imposing monetary values. They actually have impacts on the way people think about things. They're transformative of values as well. So, for example, if you pay for sex, it's prostitution. It's not love. Okay, you go into a different relationship. If you think you can buy friends, you do not understand the concept of friendship. Okay? These are fundamentally different things. But also what markets do when you go down this route of putting monetization into everything is you start equating harm and good. And this is the core aspect of the offsets markets. This is what they're doing. They're trying to equate harm, damages, destruction with what they regard as good, which is increased profits, money, and so on. So this is a real problem, right? So if you put up offset markets, what you're doing is you're doing what's called commensuration. You're making things measurable and equating them so they become equivalent to each other. And the more you can do that, the bigger the market you can get. That's what the offset markets want. They want to create commensuration and make it as wide as possible so they can have very big markets, right? Things are equated here. So, you destroy a wetland over here, then you want to replace it, like Fred said, with a totally different ecosystem. Then you've got a bigger market. So this then leads me to understanding a little bit about the types of values we're talking. Let me just give you a little example. Zaza Gabor lived to 99, right? Famous actress. When she was asked what her greatest achievement was by a reporter, she said, "I found a way to keep my husband young and healthy." "Wow," says the reporter, "how do you do that?" "I get a new one every 5 years." Zaza Gabor had 9 husbands, by the way. But the point here is that what is Zaza Gabor saying? What's she valuing? Right? She's not valuing the specific. She's not valuing the husband. She's valuing a category that fulfills a certain end. And this is exactly what we see when we move into this kind of approaches of ecosystem services, is that it's a general thing. So environmental examples. So in human geography, people talk about sense of place, having a sense of place. All of us grew up somewhere. We have an understanding of certain environments, places that we love, places that we have lived in, and we understand there was nature there were animals there were trees and plants there. You destroy that, you take away emotion and history from people. You cannot replace that. So this is about having a sense of place and valuing something which is specific, not general. So a purely general evaluation of biodiversity, the constituents are not valued as particular objects, but for the properties they possess that enable them to deliver relevant services, like Zaza Gabor's husbands. It's an end state view of nature. So what you've got now is what matters is only the state of biodiversity or ecosystems in as far as they affect the delivery of ecosystem services. They can be knocked out. Two things can provide the same end state, then you can just substitute them. You can get rid of them. So it's a very generalized way of valuing. It's not about the specific, and it misses out on all sorts of aspects of value. So what we have then is public policy implications of all of this. The basic aim is to push nature into capitalist markets, right? Nature-based solutions, as has been mentioned, and was mentioned in the plenary this morning. I was the only one who booed, actually. People were clapping. But nature-based solutions is, as Fred said, is about offsetting and offset markets. It's highly problematic. Nature is becoming capital, right? When it's like the Dasgupta review, making nature into capital means you're expecting a rate of return in money values. Ecosystems becoming services, giving a benefit to humans measured in money terms in that generalized sense. What is this for? To justify the claim that investment can be made optimally in a capitalist market economy, a social market economy, and to hide the role of planning and the creation of institutions that is essentially part of what you get when you look at social provisioning. Okay. Basically, I'm just going to finish, right? The last point, all the prices are wrong, right? All the prices are wrong. Pricing and internalizing everything to get the markets to work means that you have to price every single atom of carbon, for example, in your carbon market if you want it to be efficient. Otherwise, what you don't price is left out. What about, as I mentioned earlier, female labour? How much of that is going to be included or not included? Which species are we going to value? If you can't value them in monetary terms and measure them and put them into money terms, they're left out. What's in the market, what's out of the market? Whatever you do, it means that you've changed the prices in the market. So the prices in the market are dependent upon what's planned to be in the market and what's out of the market. That means that the prices change whenever you change the institutions. All the prices are wrong. There is no such thing as the right price. So, what does that mean? It means that whether you plan the prices explicitly or not, whatever's in and out is going to be relative to your institutional structures. And what this means is that we live in a planned economy. There is no such thing as a free market. All economies are planned. So, if we have a planned economy, then why don't we explicitly plan it? Why do we have to create these markets and these pseudo-markets and these pseudo-prices? What we should be doing is actually planning the market straight. What we do not need is a social market economy, as Vandana was promoting. What we do need is a full variety of social ecological economies. Thank you.
Okay, so now Dr. Vandana Shiva.
Thank you so much, Marie, and thank you to all of you. I have dedicated the last 50 years of my life for the protection of biodiversity. And it's always been a struggle against commodification and bringing economies and resources to the markets. For me, biodiversity is autopoietic. It's creation making creation, life making life. Biodiversity is life in self-organized complexity, collective agency, evolutionary unfolding, just like a quantum is. The understanding of life from living systems and living organisms has converged with my understanding of the quantum non-locality and quantum coherence. As Schrödinger pointed out in his book, What is Life? Unlike machines, life is not a machine, life is not a market. Unlike machines, living systems create life's growth without entropy. They're negative entropy systems. That's why over 4 billion years, the microorganisms and the plants cooled this planet and never left pollution, because in nature there's nothing like waste and pollution. From the molecule to the cell, to the organism, to ecosystems, and the entire planet Gaia, life is based on non-separation and quantum coherence, self-organization, and symbiosis in resonance with other beings. The ecological problem began with the colonial problem, and so much is made of we need to grow the markets in order to have the finances to save the planet. Well, we know in India how every step of the colonial process created growth for England and tremendous poverty for India. We used to be 25%. We used to be 25% of the world's economy before the British. They invaded. With one line, all the land of India was turned into a commodity and private property, owned by that little island next to you. $45 trillion was extracted from India. We were reduced to 2% of the world economy. 60 million people died of famine. The peasants who were generating this growth. So growth has always been an extraction system. And for me, I'm not going to pick it up now. For me, really watching where growth extracts from, what does it leave the systems in, the ecological systems, the natural systems, the social systems, the cultural systems. Because basically, besides extracting and leaving us in poverty, colonialism created the category of a dead nature separate from humans. That's what Bacon's task was. Writing the masculine birth of time, New Atlantis, Superman will tell us. Brilliant minds would tell us how to fix the earth and enslave her. And then there was Locke, who defined property as a result of the spiritual labor of capital, justifying the enclosures of the commons, the takeover of the lands of the people. To talk about nature-based as something new that's happening, well, colonialism was nature-based. They took indigo from India under slave conditions. They took our cotton. They destroyed our textiles. They captured slaves in Africa to work on the cotton fields on the lands hijacked from the indigenous people of America. That was nature-based. I don't think it's a word that clarifies something new. It just talks about the continuity of a colonial relationship between humans and nature, and between colonizing centers and the rest of the world. You know, East India Company was created in 1600. By 1610, Locke, who defined the creation of private property, also redefined money and investment. Before that, it used to be exchange in local markets. It now became investment to make money. And the real currencies of life were forgotten. The word currency never meant money before colonialism. The word currency means flow. Flow is what flows in life to make life. The flow of the nutrition cycle, the flow of the water cycle, the flow of the energy cycle, the flow of breath from the trees to us. That is currency. Growth of those currencies is what we have to grow, but to do that we have to degrow the currency of money that is extinguishing life, biodiversity, and the flow of life. Because life is a relationship. Life is not a thing. It's not a number. Biodiversity is not an asset class. So, you know, I'm so happy that today Frederic and Clive are here, because they wrote a brilliant paper on nature, life, and relations, summarizing the Dasgupta report. And for me, it was interesting that 1992, the same interests had tried to talk about how money will save the world. The same interests had talked about how we of the South had less value. We were 1/15 of your value just because of the color of your skin. That's human capital. And natural capital, Clive has just described, how every time part of an ecosystem is commodified, the rest of the ecosystem is destroyed. My first involvement in the ecology movement was 1970s with the Chipko movement, where the British created commercial forestry. Natural forests with their diversity started to be replaced with commercial species, pine in my region, displacing the oak, the rhododendron, which supported the water system, which supported the soil system. And my sisters of Chipko came out and said, "You think these forests are timber mined for making money? These forests are our life. They give us water, they give us soil, they give us pure air." And the economics shifted, because we then were made to remember that economy is related to oikos, is related to our home, and as Aristotle pointed out, oikonomia is the art of living. What's being called the economy now He gave it a name: chromatistics, the art of money-making. That's not a substitute for the economy of living on this planet with love. Those who've got so addicted to making money out of both theft, enclosures, financialization, can't stop their addiction. And besides the offsets about which we've heard a lot, there is now an attempt to make nature disappear. But it's not just nature that disappears. If you think of the fact that 80% of the biodiversity on the planet is on 22% of the land that's left with indigenous people, shouldn't the first response be, how do they protect biodiversity? Do they protect it by treating it as a commodity? Or do they protect it by knowing they're part of an earth family? All species are our relatives. We are not the masters of the universe. We are a strand in the web of life. It's time to turn the plants, the microbes, indigenous people, women, in our teachers on how to run a real economy of life. So just before the Glasgow COP, Rockefeller Foundation and New York Stock Exchange floated the new asset class of natural asset companies to preserve and restore natural assets that ultimately underpin the ability to be there on life on Earth. They called it a vehicle to allow formation of specialized corporations that hold the rights to the ecosystem, which also means denying the rights of nature, denying the rights of the ecosystem to its integrity, to its intrinsic worth, and denying the rights of the indigenous people who have protected that ecosystem. To hold the rights of the ecosystem services produced on a given chunk of land, there's no land that's a chunk of land, it's Mother Earth everywhere. Services like carbon sequestration and clean water. These NSCs will then maintain, manage, and grow the natural assets they commodify with the end goal of maximizing the aspects of the natural asset that are deemed by the company to be profitable. That means every diverse ecosystem is shrunk to a commodity to be extracted. This is continuing the illusions that have brought us to the brink. It is continuing the illusion that money is the currency of life when life is the currency of life. And as the indigenous people, North American indigenous people reminded us, not till you have poisoned the last river, killed the last fish, cut the last tree, will you realize you can't eat money. $4,000 trillion of financial assets is what the financial world is dreaming of, with dead rivers, disenfranchised people, biodiversity extinction accelerated. And this biodiversity extinction, in my view, is by design, both of the industrial system of farming as well as the financial system that constantly drives out that which the market doesn't value. And the communities. It is an extinction of the communities that have protected the earth so far, which is why financialization of nature is a false way to go. Recognizing, respecting rights of Mother Earth, her last species, her last child, is the way to go.